Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
At the beginning of the Crucible, mid-20th century playwright Arthur Miller's classic interpretation of the Salem witch panic, Betty Parris, the 10-year-old daughter of Salem minister Samuel Parris, lies catatonic in bed. She has been unconscious in bed since her father discovered her and many of the other girls of the village dancing around a fire in the forest. It's likely just a medical problem, but Parris can't forget the weird dancing and chanting that he heard around the fire, and deep down, he fears that something unnatural has happened to his daughter. He begs his niece, Abigail Williams, to tell him what she knows. "Abigail, if you know something that may help the doctor," he begs, "for God's sake, tell it to me." He then describes what he saw in the woods, his suspicion going to Tituba, his enslaved African woman from Barbados, who he saw leading the dance. "I saw Tituba waving her arms over the fire when I came on you. Why was she doing that? And I heard a screeching and gibberish coming from her mouth. She was swaying like a dumb beast over that fire."
In hopes that he can get to the bottom of this unsettling situation, Parris has invited the Reverend Hale, a learned man of both science and religion, to come to Salem to investigate. He interrogates Abigail Williams, who quickly shifts the blame to Tituba. Hale turns to Tituba and expertly manipulates information out of her, whipping her into a spiritual frenzy by asking her to open herself and let God shine his holy light on her, helping her to reveal what she knows. Others in the room ask Tituba, their voices hysterical, whether she saw the devil and what members of the village may have been cavorting with him. The final scene of Act 1 of the play culminates in a desperate monologue from Tituba, where she reveals to Hal and Parris that she did see the devil. Quote, "Oh, how many times he bid me kill you, Mr. Parris. He say, Mr. Parris must be kill. Mr. Parris, no goodly man. Mr. Parris, mean man and no gentle man. And he bid me rise out of my bed and cut your throat. But I tell him, no, I don't hate that man. I don't want to kill that man. But he say, you work for me, Tituba, and I make you free. I give you pretty dress to wear and put you way high up in the air, and you gon' fly back to Barbados. And I say, you lie, devil, you lie. And then he come one stormy night to me, and he say, look, I have white people belong to me. And I look, and there was Goody Sarah Good."
Her accusation sets off a wild final scene. Abigail begins to beg for the sweet love of Jesus and screams that she too saw Goody Good with the devil, and Bridget Bishop, and Goody Osborne. Betty Parris, who has been thus far unconscious laying in bed, suddenly sits up and screams that she saw Martha Bellows with the devil. Parris is shouting his thanks to God as the rest of the girls cry out the names of other women they saw cavorting with the devil. And in the midst of this mass hysteria, the curtain drops on Act 1.
It's a powerful and intense scene. You see the dangers coming for the women accused by the girls. You see the sway that the cunning Abigail Williams, who's trying to get her former lover's wife out of the way with her accusations, has over the younger girls. But what almost goes without notice is something in Tituba's short monologue, the longest chunk of dialogue she has in the play, by the way, that the devil offered her freedom from enslavement, material goods she could not dream of as a bondswoman, a return to her homeland, and a position of literal height over white residents of Salem.
Arthur Miller's Tituba is a useful character. She's the only non-white character, and she's the one who conducts the ritual in the woods, which Miller styles as a kind of Barbadian voodoo ceremony. The only real witchcraft in the witchcraft panic, in Miller's telling, comes from the Black Tituba, who does have knowledge of potions and enchantments. In the play, there's more than one bad woman. There's the plotting temptress Abigail Williams, the embittered crone Anne Putnam, the frigid wife Elizabeth Proctor, but Tituba is set up as the simple, stupid, black, bad seed at the center of the witch panic. She may not have had a larger plot role, but it is she who brought the foreign devil, voodoo, into Puritan Salem. The Crucible is now part of the American literary canon. It's taught in high schools across the United States, often interwoven in English and social studies curricula to explore literary tools like metaphor and allegory, at the same time as teaching the history of the very real Salem witch panic of 1692. And while Miller, famously, wrote the play as an allegory to McCarthyism and the 1950s blacklist, he was also explicit in the introduction that the play was largely historically accurate. And yet, there is a glaring error in the play. The historical Tituba was not an ignorant pawn, nor, indeed, was she a black Barbadian voodoo queen. Who was the real Tituba? The answer is, well, not clear. But today we'll explore the history of how she has been used, interpreted, and sought out by scholars, poets, and playwrights since the early 18th century. Today, for this installment of our Bad Women series, we are talking about Tituba, the quote-unquote Black Witch of Salem. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Marissa.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
This episode and this entire series is dedicated to our friend Hallie Rubenhold and her very cool podcast, Bad Women, which you'll find over at Pushkin Media. Hallie is telling the story of the 5 women who were brutally murdered in the slums of London in 1888 by Jack the Ripper. Everything you think you know about Jack and those murdered women is wrong. Check out Bad Women wherever you get your podcasts.
For those who have read The Crucible or learned about the witch trials at some point in their lives, it's likely that you have a vague recollection of Tituba. She's not the most important character in the play, and she mostly fades into the background after Act 1. But her monologue in Act 1 and her role in the dancing ritual, which actually takes place before the play begins, and so you don't actually see it, it's described but not seen, they're critical to the action of the rest of the play. So if casual readers remember anything about Tituba, it's likely that she's of African descent, she's black, and she's enslaved.
The fact that Tituba is from Barbados is repeated several times in the book. When Abigail Williams is asked what Tituba said to call the devil in the dancing ritual, she says, "I know not. She spoke Barbados." When asked what they were doing in the woods, Abigail says it was just for fun and they did it often. That Tituba, quote, always sings her Barbados songs and we dance, end quote. Later, Abigail escalates her claim, eager to blame the whole thing on Tituba, says that the slave came to her in her dreams. Quote, "Sometimes I wake up and find myself standing in the open doorway, not a stitch on my body. I always hear her laughing in my sleep. I hear her singing her Barbados songs and tempting me," end quote. In the 1998 film adaptation of the play, in which Daniel Day-Lewis is hot AF, well, according to Sarah.
He's always very, like, sort of like farmer dirty and sweaty. I'm into it. He's also very tortured. Okay. He's very tortured. You know how I feel about
that sounds like
characters.
that sounds like your cup of tea. So you can really see where Abigail's coming from. Mm-hmm. So in the 1998 film adaptation of the play, the opening scene depicts the unseen forest ritual.
Right. I should explain, in the play, that what happens in the forest is never shown. It happens before the play begins. But in the movie opens with that ritual. Like, they actually show it.
Right. Tituba oversees the girls as they name men who they want to fall in love with them, and then holds up a chicken, swinging it around her head before dancing and singing in an unknown, presumably African language, while at the center of the ring of white girls. Though it's not explicitly stated, this scene fashions Tituba as a voodoo priestess.
So, if you take anything from the play and from the film about Tituba, it's that she's Afro-Barbadian and knowledgeable in foreign magic rituals. While the play doesn't exactly state it, Miller is drawing on what he knows his audience assumes about Afro-Caribbean slave religion. And those assumptions aren't conjured entirely out of nothing. As we've discussed in several of our episodes, like those on sugar and slave rebellions in the Caribbean, there was a great deal of separation between white enslavers and the enslaved in Caribbean sugar colonies like Barbados. As a result, the enslaved developed their own religious practices, and there was little effort to formally convert them to Christianity. These practices were often an amalgamation of different African traditions, including aspects of Christianity, as members of different West African tribes mingled on Caribbean plantations. Often, those practices included nighttime rituals that included drumming, dancing, and singing.
White observers, especially those who were adherent to strict and straight-laced European faiths, interpreted these rituals as not only animalistic and crude, but also vaguely satanic. Felix Spory, a Swiss physician, described these rituals as, quote, idolatrous ceremonies in honor of their god who was mainly the devil, unquote. The slaves danced, and he said, with, quote, terrifying shrieks and bodily movements, end quote, that seemed vaguely demonic to buttoned-up Europeans. Other white viewers associated the rituals with dark magic, even more akin to what we might recognize now as voodoo. An English military officer stationed in Barbados described the rituals as diabolical magic, led by a man called the Obia, who would torment others with physical and spiritual pain, causing, quote, lameness, madness, loss of speech, and loss of all their limbs, end quote. Which
all of their limbs just like fell off?
Their limbs just fall off. And
it sounds unfortunate. He was just like...
Wow. This viewer referred to Obeah, a practice which probably originated in West Africa, in which practitioners, Obeah men, harnessed spirits in order to work magic. The practice had many names and was practiced across the West Indies. Shango in Trinidad, Obeah in Jamaica, voodoo in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and juju in Barbados.
I can never read the word Santeria without singing the song. I don't practice Santeria. You know what I'm talking about? That song?
No.
God damn
I don't.
You were too busy like listening to your like terrible early 2000s emo
screamo.
Blech. Yeah. Okay. So Miller was pulling on that voodoo / Obeah thread in the Crucible to create the illicit ritual that sets off the initial tension in the play. That the girls have been caught doing something that would get them in huge trouble with the theocratic village leadership, right? It's kind of like it's just the thing that he puts in there to create that tension. But Miller also uses Tituba for another theme in the play, the contrast between white and black. And we're going real English class here for a minute. When Hale, Paris, and Ann Putnam are questioning Tituba at the end of Act 1, they ask who the devil appeared with, and she says a woman, but she couldn't say who because it was black dark. A few lines later, Miller places emphasis on the word white when Tituba tells that the devil said, "Look, I have white people belong to me." The bewitched girls are described as having black hearts and are up to black mischief. Abigail and Samuel Paris both accuse others of blackening their names. And in the final scene of the play, where John Proctor almost saves his own life by flipping and falsely confessing and naming names of other quote-unquote witches, he accepts his fate by saying, quote, "I have confessed myself. Is there no good penitence but it be public? God does not need my name nailed upon the church. God sees my name. God knows how black my sins are. It is enough." On the flip side, whiteness is associated again and again with cleanliness, pureness, and innocence. After resolving not to sign his name to the false confession, Proctor tears up the paper and proclaims through his tears, "You have made your magic now, for now I do not think I see some shred of goodness in John Proctor, not enough to weave a banner with, but white enough to keep it from such dogs." To preserve that white glimmer of goodness, John Proctor hangs. Tituba, who represents the ignorant and exotic evil that has set off the hysteria in Salem, is the only Black character. John Proctor, at the end, chooses to hang in order to cling to his whiteness.
So Miller's version of the witch panic in Salem hinges on a few things. That Tituba is Barbadian, that Tituba is Black, that Tituba had knowledge of foreign magic rituals, and that the audience will connect those things in their imaginations with some kind of popular idea of voodoo. And in turn, because the Crucible is the cultural artifact that most people associate with the Salem witch panic, the general modern understanding of Tituba has, in a way, been shaped by her depiction in the play.
The only problem is, nearly every aspect of this depiction of Tituba is fiction. I mean, come on, you must have seen that coming, right? We were building up to it for quite a while. Tituba may have spent time in Barbados, but several scholars don't think she was actually born there. She was enslaved, but she was almost certainly not Black or African. None of the actual folk magic rituals that the Salem girls participated in, both with and without Tituba, were of Caribbean or voodoo origin. So, this raises a couple of questions. First, of course, who actually was Tituba? Second, how did she morph into the version that Miller latched onto? And finally, how have writers and scholars used different versions of Tituba to make their version of the Salem witch panic fit their own political and cultural ends? So, let's start with what we know about the real-life Tituba. In the first documents of the witch trials, the warrant for Sarah Osborne and Tituba's arrest, Tituba is referred to as Titibe, an Indian woman servant, and Titibe, Indian, twice. In one of Tituba's interrogations on March 1st, 1692, she's referred to as Tituba, an Indian woman, twice. In the next document, she's called the Indian woman. And without seeing this, you wouldn't know this, but every version of this, of all of these words, is spelled totally different. So Indian is spelled differently, Tituba is spelled differently, so just bear with us when we say Tituba 100 different ways. On March 2nd, she's referred to in another interrogation as Tituba the Ind Womb. Wooam. In another document from March, she's referred to as Tituba Indian twice. Altogether, and I think that this is as correct as I could possibly be without, re-flipping through these documents 100 times. I believe that Tituba is referred to as Indian at least 19 times. She is never, not even once, referred to as African or Black. There is no evidence in the trial documents that anyone in Salem Village thought that Tituba was African.
That's pretty clear-cut to me. Historian Elaine Breslaw, in her book Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem, did find reference to an enslaved child named Tituba in Barbados in 1676. She argues that Tituba was likely an Arawak Indian born in the Spanish Main, likely modern-day Venezuela or Guyana. She makes this claim based on the fact that there were few Arawak Indians native to Barbados and supports her hypothesis with an extended analysis of the potential origins of the name Tituba. Side note, this is a good example of how historians try to use sources creatively when there is very little source material.
Yeah, and we can have a debate over whether this is good history work, whether this is, something that we should do. But she had so little to work with that, it is understandable that she used what she had.
Yeah, that's what you have to do. You have to use what you have, or those people, their stories go untold entirely, which is the other option.
Exactly.
The name, she says, has a Spanish flavor. Ooh, I don't even understand what that means.
I don't know either, but that's what she says.
It has Spanish flavor, guys, and is similar to the names of several different bands of Arawaks, but particularly the Tetibatana, located near a river that flows through Venezuela and Guyana. She then explains that Arawaks often went by names that related to the name of their band or community, with endings that related to their sex. So, for instance, a woman of the Tetibatana tribe would go by Tetibatado. Here's the connection she makes from a name like Tetabatado and the historical Tituba. A Barbados planter, hearing the Spanish-sounding name, may well have dropped the ending syllable and called a member of the tribe by the name Tetabe, which, with its variant spellings, including Tituba, Tatuba, and Tituba, end quote.
So again, hanging a lot on sort of presumption and, that sort of it's reasonable to believe, like, it's really like
tenuous.
Yeah, tenuous is the right word.
But it's also I think it's a valid method. It's a linguistic method. Like there's a lot of especially when it comes to enslaved and indigenous folks in the Americas or in Africa, there's a lot of historians that have to do like linguistic work like this to get anywhere. So to me, it makes total sense.
Yeah, exactly. But
that doesn't. She's not saying this is definitely what happened.
Sure.
She's saying this.
Yeah, it's very speculative. Like, she's very careful to be very speculative, and that's one reason I was glad I was doing this episode with you, because I knew that you would have sort of like the insight of a scholar of very early America.
A speculative scholar.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, that you would have the insight of like how you have to use sources, because sources are so different than the kind of sources that, say, a 20th century Americanist is going to have, right? There's just more documentation in that time period than there was in the 17th century, especially when you're looking at the enslaved.
Right.
So Breslaw isn't the only scholar who rests their argument about Tituba's ethnicity on the etymology of her name. Peter Hoffer, who has written several books about Salem, uses a similar methodology but comes to entirely different conclusions. He argues that Tituba was Yoruba, born in West Africa, sold into slavery, and transported to Barbados in the transatlantic slave trade. He bases this, it seems, almost entirely on the fact that Tituba and Yoruba kind of sound similar, which, to be fair, is kind of also what Breslaw does in her Tete Batana, Tete Batado, Tituba argument. Hoffer's argument, though, doesn't bear the same scrutiny that Breslaw's does, simply because the vast majority of the actual documentation of the Salem witch trials refers to Tituba as Indian. He tries to suggest that this is because Tituba had a kind of common law marriage to a man named John Indian. But there's no evidence from this time that women's ethnicity would have been changed or shaped by an interracial marriage. So, in other words, it doesn't seem likely, or it's not supported in other evidence, that when, say, a white woman married an Indian man, like just using that as an example, not that that was very common, that she would then be referred to as Indian. Does that make sense?
Well, if that was used as his surname,
right,
then I can see that she would have been known as Tituba Indian or something, because and then other people would just say, oh, well, she's an Indian then, because we keep calling her Tituba Indian.
I think that's the argument that Hoffer is making.
Right. I mean,
and if you dig really into this, the many debates on this, and the person who's written about this the most, oh geez, I can't think of what his first name is. Bernard Rosenthal, just kind of points out that, like, there really isn't any evidence that she and John Indian were married or even had a relationship at all. And so it's based on almost more speculation than Breslaw's is, I guess.
I mean, it seems even more tenuous to me.
Yeah. And there's so much evidence to counter it that it is up against more than Breslaw's if that makes sense. You have to disregard more evidence to believe Hoffer's interpretation than you do Breslaw's.
Yeah.
Where was I? Okay. So, further, Peter Hoffer, in his sort of linguistic analysis of the name Tituba, leans really heavily on the UBA, the Yuba ending of Tituba. But that's also a problem, because in the documents of the witch trials, her name is spelled a zillion different ways, including many ways that don't end with Yuba at all. So it's possible, for instance, that it wasn't pronounced Tituba, that it was pronounced Titebe or whatever, and it was just Tituba was one of the many different ways that it was misspelled. We just are used to the name Tituba because that's the one that historians have seized on. It may not actually have been the name that she used or the way that she pronounced it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that both of these interpretations are valid and possible. I would say that the Breslau idea seems to hold up a little better, but I can see why Peter Hoffer makes these suggestions, because it does seem more unlikely that there would be an Arawak Indian from the Spanish Main who ended up in Puritan New England. Like, I feel like there are fewer of them, unless there is some kind of migration pattern that I don't know about, but I haven't really heard much about that. Whereas it makes a lot more sense that an Afro-Caribbean woman would...
Yeah, if you're looking at sort of like the general pattern of like who you would imagine an enslaved person in, colonial New England was, it makes more sense to us that it would be a enslaved African woman who came by way of Barbados, just because we know that was more common, and that's the pattern that we are more familiar with. But Breslau did a lot of work sort of explicating why it would have been that an Arawak Indian from, say, Venezuela ended up in Barbados in the first place, and then how she went from Barbados to New England. And she's certainly not saying that that was common. She's saying that that is kind of an unusual sort of contingent thing that happens just because of Samuel Parris, because Samuel Parris was both, had ties to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and also ties to Barbados in a way that not a ton of other Puritan New Englanders did. So it's that in itself is kind of unusual. And that's kind of what makes this whole thing happen.
Right. It's certainly not impossible at all.
No.
Not even implausible. It's just if
different.
you were going by sheer numbers, you would the Afro-Caribbean would make more sense.
And that's why it makes sense to us, all of the versions that we're familiar with, that Tituba was black.
Right. It's an easy assumption to make.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So now that we sort of know Tituba's ethnicity, now that we have some ideas about Tituba's ethnicity, before we explore how Tituba became African in the public eye and, the scholarly mind also, let's just clear up how the real Tituba was involved in the witch panic in Salem. Tituba was somehow enslaved, perhaps as a child in a slaving raid into Venezuela, and brought to Barbados, where she eventually came to be inherited by Samuel Parris, who was in Barbados overseeing the sugar plantation he inherited from his father. By the time she came to live with Samuel Parris, she was a teenager. Elaine Breslau claims, with no real evidence, that it was likely that she served as Parris's concubine, writing, quote, whether she found Parris attractive and was willing to satisfy his sexual needs, or if she dreaded her new role in his household, can only be surmised. She came from a South American society in which chastity was not valued and girls were occasionally given to men to pay off debts, end quote.
Yikes, right?
I mean, yeah, yikes, and also, South American society valued chastity more than almost any other society. So it's really weird that she's not more specific there. I think she means an indigenous society or something. Indigenous South American society. Because at this point, the Spanish and Portuguese had been in South America for 200 years or something. 150 years. So, that's annoying to me that she said it that way.
I think that's a really important point to highlight. She makes kind of sweeping statements like that and makes a lot of assumptions. I think that there is, in my reading of her book, I thought that it was really fascinating and I learned a lot. And as if you go through the show notes, I footnote to her very often. But then sometimes the power of some of her interpretations would be kind of taken away by these other statements that she made, where I'm kind of like, really? She came from a South American society in which chastity was not valued? Like, that's just kind of like this really broad statement that, like, I feel like when you're saying something like that, like, you really got to have receipts.
Right.
And
yeah,
it's also, she's kind of using it to make this, I don't know, sort of suggest that, like, maybe she was she wasn't, I don't know, like, she was into this relationship with Paris. She also has no evidence that she and Paris had any kind of relationship at all. So it just, that whole section of her book, I was kind of like, why?
Right.
Other than maybe
she's kind of saying, like, oh, this was like, just there's more of the usual to Tituba or something.
Exactly.
Which
that
we have no evidence of that.
Right. And more of the usual of slavery in general. Like, we know that slave owners raped their slaves, and we know that they had concubines.
But it's okay because they came from societies where chastity wasn't valued. Yeah.
Sure. And also, we can just assume that this would have been going on in this relationship because he was a youngish man and she was a youngish woman. And, like, I don't know. I just feel like you have to have a little more evidence than that. It made me think a lot of Celia, our Celia episode, because he so carefully demonstrates why he came to that conclusion. And, Celia said that in all of her testimony. Yeah. So anyway. Yeah, just want to make sure that we flag that's a I mean,
if I read that statement in the book, I would be like, what?
Exactly. What? Yeah. There was a few statements like that in the book. So either way, in 1680, Samuel Parris moved from Barbados back to Boston, bringing Tituba with him. She arrived in a city that was distrustful of Indians, still reeling from King Philip's War, also known as Metacom's War, which was a protracted and destructive war between the New England colonists and several local Indian tribes between 1675 and 1678. I'm really, really simplifying that. Maybe someday we do an episode on that, but it's very complicated, so we're just going to leave it there for now. Still, Indian house servants were quite common in New England, and Tituba would have had more rights than a slave in Barbados. Later, in 1680, Parris married, soon had 2 children, and became a Puritan minister. In 1689, the family moved to Salem, where Parris had been called to pastor. Parris was not exactly popular in Salem, and the villagers weren't impressed with his preaching or with his requested salary. In the fall of 1691, the village committee out and out refused to pay Parris or to provide him with any firewood for the long, cold Massachusetts winter. I really see that as, like, we're not going to pay you and not going to give you any firewood either. Yeah, like, it's like the like final like, you at the end of that.
Yeah.
In turn, Parris's sermons started to focus on the conspiracy of Satan against the church and against the people of Salem. So, he's using his sermons to kind of focus on issues of conspiracy and being persecuted, right? He's sort of working out his personal things through his sermons.
Right. And to kind of, like, in a weekly
push back
way, sort of like needling.
Exactly. Right. So in 1691, things were unsettled and anxious in the Parris household and in Salem in general.
This is when, in the winter of 1692, 2 little girls of the Parris household, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, who was Parris's niece, began to try to tell their fortune using an Old English folk practice in which they cracked eggs into a glass and read the shape of the yolk. They believed that they saw the shape of a coffin in the blobs. They did this on their own, and there's no evidence that Tituba was involved in this divination. But after their gross egg game, Betty Parris became mysteriously ill with weird symptoms like the sensation of being choked, pinched, and seeing visions. Finally, after weeks of her suffering, the Parris' neighbor, Mary Sibley, came up with a plan to figure out who was bewitching little Betty. She enlisted Tituba and the other enslaved Indian in the Paris household, John Indian, to help her prepare a so-called witch cake made of rye meal and urine. Barf. That sounds, oh my God. Just
I know.
Whose urine?
The girls.
That's my question.
The girls specifically.
Well, okay.
That's important. Yeah.
All right. I mean, if you're going to have to, eat urine, it should be little girl's urine, I guess.
Well, thankfully, they didn't have to eat it. So that's good.
All right, good. The witch cake was then fed to a dog, which would, according to lore, reveal the name of its witch companion.
And just as like a side note here, I should say that a lot of the scholars of the Salem witch trials, and I certainly didn't read everyone, there's like 1 bajillion books written on the Salem witch trials, but many of them believe that Betty Paris was probably having like somatic symptoms, right? That like she lived in such a powerfully theocratic society. She knew that what she had been doing was illicit, and then was really stressed about it. And that stress sort of revealed itself in all of these, weird things. Her brain was trying to deal with the stress of what they had been doing. Of course, we don't have hard facts, like hard evidence of that, but it seems pretty reasonable to me. So scholars are more or less agreed that this pea flower, urine flower, I should say, cake was English folk magic. There's no evidence at all that this was Tituba's actual idea, or that Tituba had any particular knowledge or experience with either white or dark magic. Instead, Elaine Breslaw has suggested that Tituba and John Indian were actually roped in by Mary Sibley, the neighbor, because she assumed that they had experience with magic, mostly because they were Indians. In other words, they were brought into it because Indians in general were believed to have special magic knowledge, not that these particular Indians had magic knowledge. Moreover, it would just be easy for Tituba to get the ingredients needed for the cake, particularly the urine. She'd have access to Betty Paris's urine as a house servant in the Paris household.
But that makes sense, yeah. From there, you likely know the story. Betty and Abigail became more and more hysterical, and their bizarre symptoms spread to other girls in the village. Soon, the Reverend Paris had to call in outside experts to help him figure out what was happening to the girls. He interviewed the girls themselves, following the example of ministers like Cotton Mather. In these interrogations, the girls identified 3 women as the culprits: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Each kind of a social outcast in Salem village. The 3 were arrested, imprisoned, and interrogated in a series of hearings. Both Good and Osborne denied all the charges, but Tituba, called last to take the stand, confessed to consorting with the devil, blamed the other women for forcing her to hurt the children, and telling a wild tale about secret covens, evil animals, and hairy imps. From there, more and more and more people were implicated as those who were accused desperately tried to save themselves.
It's possible that before her arrest and questioning, Tituba was beaten by Samuel Paris. The evidence for this only comes from one writer, Robert Califf, who wrote a history of the witch trials in 1700. But Elaine Breslaw makes an argument about this potential beating that I think is actually really interesting. Paris obviously believed that something nefarious was afoot and believed that Tituba was part of it. When he asked Tituba what she had done, and she insisted that nothing had happened, or, only something that was fairly innocuous, like the pea cake, the urine cake, he beat her, which taught her pretty quickly that was not what her master wanted to hear. So when she got on the stand in the hearing, she simply said what she thought the interrogators would want to hear. And the ultimate result was that while the panic grew and more people were implicated, Tituba was ultimately rewarded for flipping and was not convicted or executed. In the end, 18 people were hanged and 1 crushed during the witch panic. Tituba, on the other hand, spent a miserable 18 months in prison and then was sold off to pay for the prison fees. From there, Tituba simply disappears completely from the written record.
That is what we actually know about Tituba's role in the witch panic. So how did we get from an enslaved Indian woman transported to New England and then reluctantly drawn into a witch panic to an African voodoo priestess conducting mysterious rituals in the dark of night? To answer that question, my friends, we need historiography. Woo! Historiography!
Woohoo!
We've actually seen how the initial record is shaped by the histories that follow. Take, for instance, the way that the allegation that Paris beat Tituba into eventually confessing changed the narrative. And that was among the very first things written about the witch panic. In 1828, we have the first novel about Salem called Rachel Dyer, in which author John Neal refers to Tituba as a woman of diabolical power. It's here, says Salem scholar Bernard Rosenthal, that, quote, the Tituba legend begins to assume its future shape, end quote. A few years later, Charles Upham, a reverend and member of Congress who fashioned himself a historian of the witch trials, wrote his first set of lectures on Salem. In 1867, he expanded those lectures into a full-length history called Salem Witchcraft. In this text, Upham introduced two new details to the story. First, that Tituba and John Indian had brought ideas about Barbados magic into Salem, and second, that Tituba held secret meetings with the girls of Salem and, quote, inflamed their imaginations with those tales, end quote, of Barbados voodoo. While he doesn't quite call her diabolical, he suggests that she was superstitious and certainly an instigator of things to come.
It was other works of fiction that helped to transform Tituba in the 19th century. Elizabeth Gaskell, the British author famous for her novel North and South, wrote a short story called Lois the Witch, which, I don't know why, but just the name Lois the Witch makes me laugh. She wrote this story in 1859, and it features two Indian women. One, an, quote, old Indian crone named Natty, who has weird stories that she told to, quote, young girls of the oppressing race, which had brought her down to a state little differing from slavery and reduced her people to outcasts on the hunting grounds that had belonged to her fathers, end quote. The other was a gentler woman named Hota, who nonetheless is beaten into false confession because she is Indian, like the maleficent Natty. She based her characters on Upham's initial lectures, which, in turn, it seems, influenced Upham's book-length history. So she writes her stories based on the early lectures, and then when Upham revises those lectures into his history, he actually uses this fictional account to kind of shape his later book.
Right. Yeah.
So there's lots of this, so it gets kind of confusing. Mm-hmm. Rosenthal writes this about this whole kind of sharing. Gaskell's probable use of Upham creates a striking irony. The British storyteller reads the American historian and embellishes his tale to create a fictional role for Tituba and a circle of girls. A decade later, Upham incorporates that fiction into his history, establishes an enduring myth, and the generations that follow subscribe to a tale told by a 19th century historian that may, indeed, have been invented by a 19th century British novelist.
Yeah, but that's like what Victorian historians did. that's par for the course.
I mean, I don't know as if I would say that it was totally unheard of, but it's also wrong, right? It's, you know, I don't think that Rosenthal is saying that this is a shocking case and and had never happened before, but that this is the
No, I'm not saying he is saying that. I'm saying that sounds about right. Like, I think a lot of 19th century British
sourcing was not really, there were not really strict standards.
Right. And they were kind of like, you know, they often romanticize things. So they wanted to tell a good story and stuff.
Definitely.
Right. So we can't pin it completely on Gaskell, though. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow also wrote fiction about the witch trials in the form of an 1868 play called Giles Corey of the Salem Farms. Longfellow's Tituba is first described as an Indian woman, but later as half African, whose father was an Obi man who taught her magic. In the first lines of the play, Tituba has a lengthy monologue in which she catalogs her herbal remedies and considers the powers they give her over the white people in Salem. Quote, I, Tituba, an Indian and a slave, am stronger than the captain with his sword, am richer than the merchant with his money, am wiser than the scholar with his books, mightier than ministers and magistrates with all of the fear and reverence that attend them. For I can fill their bones with aches and pains, can make them cough with asthma, shake with palsy, can make their daughters see and talk with ghosts, or fall into delirium and convulsions. I have the evil eye, the evil hand, a touch from me and they are weak with pain, a look from me and they consume and die. The death of cattle and the blight of corn, the shipwreck, the tornado, and the fire, these are my doings, and they know it not. Thus I work vengeance on mine enemies, who, while they call me slave, are slaves to me. End quote.
This seems like a real influence on Arthur Miller to me. That shorter monologue that she has at the end of Act 1 is really sort of saying the same thing as Wadsworth, or as Longfellow has her saying, but just kind of boiled down, right? That this is about an enslaved person seeking some kind of power that they can't have in their everyday life. When George Bancroft, the famed American historian of the 19th century, issued an updated version of his History of the United States in 1876, his description of the witch trials changed Tituba from Indian, as she had been in all of the previous editions of that book, to half Indian, half Negro. It seems the only source Bancroft had for this was Longfellow, which was a lyrical play and definitely not history, which is interesting because Bancroft is often held up as one of the first professional historians when history kind of started to be done in the mode of like a social science in a more objective,
right,
professionalized way.
Yeah, and not just sort of antiquarianism.
Right.
Of.
Like Upham was. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, Bancroft was wrong about a lot of things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, for sure.
And once again, I think a lot of it does come from that impulse to romanticize.
Sure.
I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that even Bancroft, the professional historian, is still kind of doing the same thing.
Right.
Historian John Fisk's book, New France and New England, which was published in 1904, took the half-breed theory and further embellished Tituba's character, making her fit what can only be assumed was a pre-existing idea that he had about mysterious, exotic women of color. He wrote that Samuel Parris owned, quote, 2 colored servants who he had brought with him from the West Indies. The man was known as John Indian. The hag, Tituba, who passed for his wife, was half Indian and half Negro. Their intelligence was of a low grade, but it sufficed to make them experts in palmistry, fortune-telling, magic, second sight, and incantations. There is not a shred of evidence for any of that.
Yeah, I mean, just sounds it sounds interesting, and yeah. The modern historian Chadwick Hansen points out that while other 20th century historians didn't adopt Fisk's explicitly racist description, they nonetheless allowed racism to color their writing about Tituba. He says it this way, quote, "It is perhaps to the credit of American intellectuals that nobody has adopted Fisk's inventions. Yet other writers' portraits of Tituba and John have also been full of inventions, and if they are less vicious than Fisk's, they are nevertheless attributable to racial stereotyping," end quote. In Marion Starkey's classic The Devil in Massachusetts, published in 1949, Tituba is described as John Indian's consort, who is half Carib and half Negro, and also half savage. Wait, how can you be 3 halves of something?
Ask Margaret or Marion Starkey.
I guess the Carib is the savage half. The savage
I think
half.
so.
Oh my god. She's described as lazy and stupid with slow Southern speech, and then later as the trembling black woman. She also, according to Starkey, quote, "yielded to the temptation to show the children tricks and spells, fragments of something like voodoo remembered from the Barbados," end quote.
I want to just underline something Marissa just said there, that Marion Starkey has her described as lazy and stupid with slow Southern speech, which makes literally no sense because she wasn't Southern. She did not come from the American South. There's no evidence of that at all. So that really, I think, just sort of highlights the assumptions that people were drawing on when they wrote about Tituba, that, in 1949, when somebody thought about an enslaved person, they were thinking about a sort of version from popular culture that just, that they were slow and Southern.
Yeah, so, like an antebellum.
Exactly.
Antebellum. What's the
like a minstrel show trope, right?
Yes, that's what I was trying to think of. That minstrel of exactly, which
it has nothing to do with Tituba. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So remember, there was no evidence of any voodoo rituals taking place at all, or any evidence that Tituba knew anything about voodoo. But once one historian said that Tituba used voodoo, it was fair game. Sociologist Kai Erikson, in his study of deviance, which centered on the witch trials called Wayward Puritans, relied almost entirely on Starkey for his descriptions of Tituba, who he says, quote, had grown up among the rich colors and imaginative legends of Barbados, and who was probably acquainted with some form of voodoo. Later, he says that she was an, quote, excitable woman who had breathed the warmer winds of the Caribbean and knew things about magic her crusty old judges would never learn. Again, this is based on nothing except, previous secondary sources and a lot of, offensive assumptions about the Caribbean, about bright colors and warm winds and
I mean, there's more offensive stuff about the Caribbean than that. Bright colors and warm winds.
Sure, but that's what he's drawing on, right?
Yeah, he's like novelizing this,
exactly.
Using his prejudices about different places. Yeah. In 1950, another fictional adaptation transformed Tituba even more. William Carlos Williams, the pediatrician poet of the Icebox Plums, wrote a play called Tituba's Children. Williams draws heavily on Starkey's Devil in Massachusetts, using whole quotes from the history in between his dialogue. Oh my God, so fucking lazy. You don't think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Just Arthur Miller's did exactly the same thing in The Crucible a few years later, but his is not purely quoted material. In Williams's play, Tituba is unsurprisingly lazy and stupid with drawling speech. Williams has Tituba writing in what can only be assumed was his idea of black slave dialect. Then there's Arthur Miller's The Crucible, first published in 1953. Miller's Tituba isn't even half Indian, but described only as the Negro slave. In the play, Tituba actually has been conducting a ritual in the woods, boiling a live frog in a kettle, slaughtering chickens for their blood, and brewing love potions. This is all designed to be vaguely voodoo.
And Chadwick Hansen has a really interesting take, I think, on why Miller sets up Tituba as black. First, of course, is to dramatize her as a kind of voodoo priestess. But in a more literary flourish, Miller also uses Tituba to underscore the white clergy as the true villains of the witch panic. In the scene where Hale gets Tituba to confess, he whips her up into a frenzy, almost exactly in the way a camp meeting itinerant minister might induce a revival goer into giving her heart to Jesus. All around her, the other girls start shouting their confessions, giving the whole scene the feeling of an ecstatic religious service. Hansen pulls no punches in explaining his opinion of the scene. He says, quote, "It is as vulgar a scene as Miller ever wrote, with Tituba featured as Aunt Jemima in the same camp meeting." Yikes.
Oh my God. Wow. So after Miller's version of the story was publicized in the very successful Crucible, even professional historians seem to import that version of Tituba into their histories. Even John Damos, who's a very well-written historian in early America and the witch trials, refers to Tituba as a Negro slave in historical work. Hansen sees this as the moment it was cemented that Tituba was now African. Quote, "When Damos adopted Miller's distortion of Tituba's race, as earlier historians had adopted Longfellow's, her metamorphosis was complete," end quote. At the end of his 1974 essay on Tituba's racial transformation, Chadwick Hansen makes a really interesting case that this is all really the product of racism, not always overtly, but more insidiously. As white historians have tried to make sense of the ultimately irrational witch trials, they've ended up adding things to the story that help it make sense. It made sense to 19th and 20th century scholars that a black Barbadian woman would have imported exotic magical practices, generally just called voodoo, from exotic magical places. Quote, "We are not free from racism as intellectuals, even those who call themselves allies," Hansen wrote, "or we will not be free of it until we recognize, among other things, that beliefs and practice which we regard as superstitious do not necessarily have racial boundaries. Until we recognize, in short, that witchcraft, when it is found in New England, is more likely to be English in origin than Indian or Negro." End quote. That's so well said.
I just loved that essay. If you're interested in this topic, I really recommend Chadwick Hansen's essay because it's just really well written and he traces all of this so clearly. And then it was written in 1974, so it's very, I think, influenced by the Black Power movement, and he kind of ties it to that at the end, and in a way that I thought was just really fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It sounds cool.
But there's yet one more transformation that happens to Tituba. Starting in the 1980s, Tituba was reclaimed by poets and novelists again as not only a black woman, but as an empowering story of a powerful black wise woman oppressed by ignorant, closed-minded white oppressors. Probably the best example of this is writer Maurice Condé's Moi Tituba, sorcière noire de Salem, or I Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. I should have had Marissa say that because she has a beautiful French pronunciation and I do not. But this book imagines Tituba's long and eventful life ranging from Barbados to Boston and then back to Barbados. In the book, Tituba really is a wise woman or an herbal healer, having learned the practice from her adopted mother, an elderly slave maroon who teaches her herbalism. And I really wanted to read some of this book to include, passages from it, but I could not find a translated copy of it anywhere. I know they exist. Lockwood, our library, did not have one. I couldn't find one on the internet. They were all French. So sorry. You'll have to go read that on your own time. Anyway, one edition of Condé's book includes a foreword by none other than Angela Davis, exclamation point, who writes that, quote, "Those who dispute Tituba's African descent, countering that she was Indian, are perhaps hoping to stir up enmity between Black and Native American women as we seek to recreate our respective histories." Davis's point here, I think, is to protect a history that, once repressed, is now being reclaimed by an oppressed people. But the problem is that it's wrong. In this case, it doesn't matter all that much because, Condé's book is fiction, and in fiction, you can do whatever you want, allowing the writer to imagine a history that otherwise couldn't be reconstructed. Tituba's mythic role as a wronged ancestor in that, we're daughters of the witches you burned sort of way continues to this day. In doing research for this episode, I came upon several modern poems about Tituba, which almost all fashioned Tituba as African or actually possessing some amount of magic knowledge. Take, for instance, the poem Tituba Speaks by Jacqueline Bishop, which was, just recently published in 2017. "The magic I brought, wrapped up tight in the bosom of my chest, to Salem, Massachusetts, came not from slaves, nor from my Guyanese Indian people, but from a white woman who taught it to me back in Barbados, where I forcefully was taken. She, the one, those days we alone on the plantation showed me how to curse someone and how to turn back the curse to cure somehow. Some nights that woman and I would look up to the flat white face of the moon, and it is true we both called the moon mother. She had a black cat about her she called familiar. There was a broom she never touched leaning against the far wall in the corner."
While in the Crucible, and even in histories of the witch panic, Tituba seems to fade into the background as the frenzy in Salem ramps up. It's clear that Tituba is an eminently useful character. She serves as the central explanation for the whole irrational, incomprehensible thing. Her foreign influence is the thing that set this whole panic in motion. And there's a kernel of truth to that. In the documents of the Salem Panic, Tituba is the first to confess and the first to implicate others in her confession, which undoubtedly saved her life. So in a sense, she did kick the whole thing off. But she didn't introduce a folk magic practice that set the whole thing in motion. Indeed, she didn't even suggest those occult practices at all. Instead, she was drawn into it because of the assumptions of those around her, that because she was Indian, because she had come to Salem from Barbados, she would obviously have experience that could help the bewitched Betty Paris. As time went on and the historical Tituba faded from the record, the imagined Tituba continued to be useful, mostly to white writers and intellectuals who sought to make some sense of the insensible Salem witch panic. And I would say that not only useful to each context within its context, right? So like late 19th century or early 20th century writers used Tituba to sort of to be this sort of symbol of this antebellum minstrelsy, Aunt Jemima type character or whatever, that fit their current imagination. You know what I mean? And so
right.
they're in a way, this is like what we want people to do. We want people to kind of see themselves and see their own lives and their worlds in history. Like, in a way, you kind of want that. But that is what makes historiography so interesting, even though it sounds boring, is that it tells us more about the people who wrote it than it does about the people they were writing about.
Right. We can see if you trace how Tituba has been portrayed in both history and in fiction, going all the way back to that first book that was written in 1700, you can see how her character changes to fit the times that people were writing in. Right? So, like, that's why we can go from a sort of menacing Tituba in, like, say, the late 19th century, one that's, this voodoo priestess who's dangerous and stupid and whatever else that, that one, I think it was John Fiske or something, described her as, to, like, in the 1980s, influenced by Black power and by the women's rights movement. Suddenly she becomes an empowering character, someone that we can kind of resurrect and cling to as sort of an example of what slavery and white puritanical religion took away.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it does kind of remind me a little bit of Cheng Yi Sao and just the ways that those errors kept sort of accumulating on one another over time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that this is something that all of our Bad Women episodes have in common in very different ways, of course. But, it makes me think of a lot of Elizabeth's episode about Rosa Parks, in that, Rosa Parks she has almost an inverse sort of, experience as Rosa Parks, where her kind of radical politics and her activism is written out of the story to make her more palatable, right? Whereas Tituba is made into the demon of the story in order to really take the onus off of the white girls so that they appear more like they were just pawns, when it seems from the historical documentation that they were really the ones that set the whole thing actually in motion.
They were the one who were practicing these sort of anti-Christian folk ways and things like
that.
Right,
and that they were English. They were based on English sort of folk practices. It's easier. It fits a certain assumption that we have that, white people never did that kind of thing, right? That's voodoo.
Right.
That's foreign and
when
exotic.
Like every single human being on the planet was a pagan, at some point, like
right.
Yeah, and everyone has folk traditions and folk practices, and that's just part of being a human being. Yeah, Yeah, it's part of that chip on the shoulder. It's that sort of imperial chip on the shoulder that, oh, we're so sort of advanced as British,
Right.
as Brits or whatever, and we've come to bring civilization to these lowly Caribs or whatever. It's it's all colonial.
It's all racist colonial bullshit.
All colonial.
We just got ourselves like blacklisted somewhere, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure. Oh, I'm sure.
We just broke the law in some states, I think.
Probably.
Because it's like,
but we're also clear about how the 1980s Black Power feminist appropriation of Tituba is also wrong. So,
Right.
that's because we're historians here, and even if we support Black women reclaiming powerful Black women in the past, that's a great thing to do. Fine, great. It's for a good cause. We're not going to pretend that that's accurate.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I have to say, I struggled with who I was going to write about for this episode. I went back and forth. It wasn't actually until, I was having dinner with two of my colleagues, Eric Seaman and Victoria Wolcott, and they actually were the ones that came up with this
Oh my God, really?
topic. And and Eric mentioned some of these authors, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll look at that. I'm interested in the Salem witch trials, but I've never. My experience with Tituba, my thought, my image, I should say, that I had in my mind of Tituba was based entirely on Miller. Because we spent so long reading that when I was in high school that it's really embedded in my brain. So shout out to Victoria and Eric for inspiring this episode. I really enjoyed it. You can really go down like a Salem witch trials black hole. And I certainly did here. It was really, really fun. So, there are, all of the sources that we talked about are in the bibliography or are linked in the transcript. So if you want to do a little digging on this topic yourself, I really encourage it. There's tons of stuff to learn. Yeah. And so that's it.
Thank you, Eric and Victoria. That was perfect.
Yes, it was really fun.
A really great topic. Okay. If you want to hear about more bad women in history, definitely check out Hallie Rubenhold's new podcast, Bad Women, The Ripper Retold.
Yeah, lots of sort of reinvestigating history in the way that we have, tried to show in these few episodes, but with the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper, and really an important historical intervention in her book, and really exciting that it's coming through in a podcast as well.
Yeah, and there's a whole other element like the true crime salaciousness sort of that we didn't get into, I don't think, in any of our Bad Women episode, but that's the part I'm most looking forward to.
Yeah, me too. There are for a transcript of this episode, go to digpodcast.org, where we have all of our episodes have full transcripts, have full bibliographies, footnotes, and additional resources. If you're interested in teaching with our episodes, go ahead and check out our For Educators page. We're constantly updating tons of lesson plans and activity ideas for you to use if you assign podcasts in your syllabuses or use them in your classroom. You can find us on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram at what? Dig_history? Dig podcast? I don't know. You can find us. You know how to Facebook. You can join our Pod Squad on Facebook. If you look for Dig History Pod Squad, we have lots of interesting debates and conversations there, and share lots of history memes, and that's fun as well. What am I forgetting, Marissa? Oh, you can buy Dig merch at our merch store. The link is on our website, but it's at TeePublic, and Averill is always coming up with weird new designs to put up there. I just bought one recently, and I like it a lot.
I just bought the medieval translators Get Your Together.
Nice.
It's like my favorite. But yeah, and also if you are not yet one of our patrons, you can go to patreon.com/digpodcast. Or
yep.
is it Dig
Help
History?
us keep this thing running.
Yep. Okay.
And thank you for listening.
What the most drawn out outro ever.
I know it was horrible. Sorry.
God,
Sorry,
so bad.
listeners.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Abigail, if you know something that may help the Abigail, if you know something that may help the doctor. Why am I saying doctor so fucking weird?
Always her laughing. Always hear her. Okay. But particularly the Tituba. Oh my god. Tatibatana. Okay. She then explains that Arawaks were often. Oh my god. What the fuck? She then explains that Arawaks were often. Oh my god. Why can't I talk?
I have no idea.
Spory? Okay. Felix Spory, a swish, oh my god. Made of rye meal and pee. Wait, piss? Like urine?
Like literal pee. Yes.
Oh, like, okay. Can I say urine? Because pee meal is a thing.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Okay.